Day 288, Fort Mason. If you were to say the words Fort Mason, the phrase Fort Mason, to a San Francisco local, depending on who you say that phrase to, one of several things will come to mind. If you say that to somebody who lives in or spends a good amount of time in the marina, they might think of the actual building that says Fort Mason on the side. There's a farmer's market there, bunch of stuff that goes on there that I'll get to. If you were to say Fort Mason to someone who maybe doesn't necessarily spend the most time down there, somebody who lives in a different part of the city, they might think of the actual geographic location, that whole area, which technically is between like the Marina District and the edge of Ghirardelli Square. So between roughly Hyde and Laguna Street up to the coast, everything past Jefferson. Those are the rough parameters of what is known as Fort Mason. And then if you were the unfortunate recipient of I guess to put this in the most diplomatic of terms, negative sides of American imperialism, well, Fort Mason probably meant something very different to you. Again, putting that in the lightest of terms possible. So, Fort Mason, like I described, is like smack over there in the Marina District. It technically includes what's known as Aquatic Park and Ghirardelli Square. So, it goes back to when Mexico controlled that part of San Francisco, the entire state at one point, and it served kind of as a defense, coastal defense, right, to protect the military interests that were going on there. And the thing is that one of the Union generals, John C. Fremont, he actually owned a bunch of land in what is now known as Fort Mason. So the military capacities of Fort Mason were kind of increased because they were scared that the Civil War would come out to California, so just in case of that. But this guy, John C. Fremont, he didn't get along with Abraham Lincoln. They had a really contentious relationship. So when he resigned, I think the year was 1862. The following year, the US government seized that entire land. And even though they compensated something like close to 50 people, John C. Fremont was not one of those that was later compensated. If I'm not mistaken, there were something like 24 different congressional committees that came to the conclusion that this man should be compensated for this land, but lawsuits going up until 1968, okay, did not properly compensate John C. Fremont's heirs for his land at Fort Mason. So, who is Fort Mason named after? Mason was actually one of the military governors before California established statehood. So how I always have understood it is that the huge population boom that was the gold rush, eventually there was a need for some kind of representative government. But before the representative government was formed, California was under a series of military governors. So that's who Fort Mason's actually named after. So Fort Mason went from kind of like defense to becoming what they call the port of embarkation, the center of the port of embarkation by the end of World War II. So by the beginning of World War II, it was not developed into what it was at the end. By the end of World War II, there were something like 13 additional sites that were acquired. And again, I'm using all of these diplomatic terms. Feel free to definitely look into the history of this, how this land was acquired, etc. But eventually, an additional 13 sites, including the Port of Oakland, of which the hub was Fort Mason, And by the end of World War II, this is the second most important transit hub in the entire United States. And again, as usual with these little clips, I'm barely scratching the surface. But if I remember correctly, it was something like 23 million tons of of actual parcels, actual like things that were transported through this system that I just designed, the port of embarkation, of which Fort Mason, and then something like 1.6 million actual passengers, like actual humans. Again, most of the things that were being transported through this hub, through these ports, were to build military bases in the Philippines and in Hawaii, which is why I say if you were on the other side of this, it's not this glossy, fascinating military history as the United States likes to do. Anyway, fast forward to the modern day. Fort Mason is now I think the National Park Service is like centered out of Fort Mason. Like I said, there's that farmer's market. There's the whole Fort Mason Center for the Arts, I think it's called. And there's like a graduate division for one of the Academy of Art Institutes. I think City College has an art hub out there. I'm, again, barely scratching the surface. Black Point has a community garden that is accessible by the American Indian Cultural District, where they're able to grow things and plants according to how their ancestors did. So it's a very dynamic part that, again, depending on who you ask, it has multiple different layers, but absolutely a part of San Francisco that you should check out when you visit. Right there, smack dab in between, technically a part of Fisherman's Wharf.